Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's PestFacts WA webinar. My name's Jeanette Pratt. I'm a research scientist based in the Moora office at DPIRD. I am going to be taking over the hosting duties for today's PestFacts webinar as Cindy Webster, the PestFacts project lead, is feeling a little bit unwell today, and so she's going to be in the background helping out, but I will be hosting. This webinar has been hosted by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, DPIRD, as part of the GRDC co-funded IPM for Grains project. So the data discussed in today's webinar has come from the GRDC co-funded modelling and disease surveillance projects that are currently listed on the screen. So moving on to today's agenda, DPIRD research scientist Jeff Thomas is going to be discussing the 2023 Broadacre disease outlook for WA, and then DPIRD research scientist Kith Siri Jayasena, Kith, will talk about the net blotch risk for this season. And right at the end, we're going to have a question and answer session. So before I hand over to Jeff, please be aware that for all the attendees that except for the presenters, everyone's going to be muted to try and increase the sound quality. The presenters will answer questions at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A or chat buttons down the bottom if you have a question or comment. And we will make the webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides available to everyone after the webinar. I'm going to hand over to Jeff now.
Thanks, Jeanette, and welcome along everybody that's out there. As Jeanette says, I'm going to be giving a sort of a brief outlook of diseases of note for 2023 and looking back maybe a little bit at 2022. I just want to make the point that whilst I'm presenting here today, this is very much a joint effort of a number of people within our everybody within our plant pathology group at DPIRD, who are obviously spaced across the wheat belt region. Obviously, when we're talking about disease risk for the season, we're talking about a combination of factors into that disease triangle. So we're talking about the environment and weather that happens within the season and leading into the season. We're talking about the presence of the pathogen. So coming out of 21 and 22, what we know is that they've been very favourable years in most areas, and so they've been big years. So we've got probably quite a lot of stubble and soil-borne inoculums, so sclerotia in soil, high stubble loads, and with the way that the season finished last year with a soft spring, potentially some risk associated with seed-borne inoculum of diseases like lupin anthracnose, chickpea ascochyta, barley scald, and obviously any green bridge risk that might come through from the rain over the recent months. And then the final part is the presence of a susceptible host, and that be that susceptible varieties. And we know for diseases like sclerotinia, spot form net blotch in barley, Septoria raveni in oats, that the majority of the varieties that we're growing are susceptible to those diseases. And so we don't have a lot of resistant varieties available there. So all of those things go together to create the disease risk that we face. So if we have a look at what's happening with the weather, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Obviously, we finished last year with a mild finish, so we were concerned of the carryover of some diseases. But I think the summer was quite dry, but we have had some occurrence of rain in the autumn period, March and April, that we can see here on the map. And that has resulted in some areas of quite reasonable plant available soil moisture, which means there is a potential for some green regrowth in areas of that March and April rain. And in those areas, maybe green regrowth has got a sort of a 4 to 8 week advance on the crops as they emerge, and that certainly means that some diseases and powdery mildews and rusts and things like that are those that may benefit from having a bit of a head start. Maybe dampening that outlook is the fact that the Bureau of Meteorology in their forward forecasts for the whole of Australia say that there's a drier than average May to July, but certainly in our West Australian environment, the statement is that much of the Southwest Land Division in WA very likely to be below median. What does that mean? Well, the implication is obviously that without moisture, moisture drives diseases, particularly, say for our stubble-borne diseases, drives the maturation of stubble or the production of conidia on stubble and therefore sporulation, and then also drives disease infection events. So maybe we'll see a delay of some of those early infections. And the implications for that might be that some of those programmed tillering or stem extension sprays, when we go out and monitor crops, aren't actually going to be needed because the levels of disease may be less than in other seasons. So certainly the weather outlook is suggesting that there may be lower disease pressure, but if we have a look at diseases of note from 2022, certainly the two diseases that we had the most phone calls about last year were powdery mildew in wheat and net blotch in barley, and we'll cover off on both of those. I'll talk about powdery mildew, and Keith is going to spend some time talking about net blotch. But generally speaking, in our surveillance, all of the normal diseases were present. So spot form net blotch we saw in the majority of barley paddocks. Maybe as we see a move from Spartacus, which is a very susceptible variety, into more resistant, slightly more resistant varieties like Maximus, we might expect to see that disease diminish in importance over time, we hope, particularly in those lower rainfall environments. We know that Septoria vini blotch, 90% of oat paddocks had that disease last year, and so we would expect to see that continuing. Blackleg in canola, 70% of the paddocks that we visited last year had some evidence of blackleg, so certainly we would expect that there is plenty of inoculum out there. So the usual diseases were present again last season. If we have a look at wheat powdery mildew, certainly a question that I've been asked quite a bit this year is, what's the outlook for powdery mildew this year? Last year, about 40% of the paddocks we visited had powdery mildew. What that means, what we know is that wheat powdery mildew is maintained over summer on stubble and then is transferred onto green plants, and that so there was plenty of inoculum out there. We know that our variety spectrum is at the susceptible end, 23 out of 37, so 60%, over 60% of our varieties at that susceptible end of the spectrum, and that represented in that is varieties like Scepter, which take up a huge amount of that crop area. So certainly any regrowth that's emerging will be susceptible. So if we have a mild, places that have had that mild wet autumn, and we saw there were areas that had plenty of soil moisture, that will predispose to further infection this year. What do we know about, what are the things that might diminish that? Well, obviously the dry period that's projected will have an impact on that. But the other thing that we do know is that upfront fungicides such as flutriafol in furrow can have a significant impact on the delaying the development of mildew and reducing its severity in season. And so that certainly, I know that there's been a lot of interest in utilising flutriafol this year, and we might see that actually diminishes the epidemic generally as the season develops. But certainly in those regions where there has been that March and April rainfall, I still think there is a risk associated with powdery mildew. If we move into barley, Kit's going to talk about net blotch, but I did just want to mention that in the Albany and Esperance port zones, about 90% of the paddocks we visited had net blotch last year, particularly damaging in the variety Planet, which we would suggest is probably in some areas is acting as a SVS or a VS variety. And certainly if you're choosing to grow Planet in that region this year, that's something to keep an eye on. I actually want to spend a little bit time talking quickly about scald. We think that's a disease for us to keep an eye on. Last season, about 15% of the paddocks that we visited had measurable levels of scald in them. It's been increasing in incidence and severity, particularly across the south coast barley growing regions over the last couple of years. It's a stubble and seed-borne pathogen, so there will be inoculum around this year. I guess the linking to the statements I just made about net blotch, growers that are looking to replace Planet in this growing season need to be aware of the resistant status of the variety they're using to replace Planet, and understand that many of those candidate varieties are susceptible or worse for scald, and we would consider that to be a disease to watch in that south coast region. One of the things we do know is that, well, it's a fast-moving disease, but the experience would suggest that it can be managed with proactive fungicide approaches. The other thing about scald we know is it's quite a variable pathogen, and that whilst there has been a dominant pathotype, there certainly does occur new pathotypes or altered virulences. And last year, particularly, despite the fact that they're represented as MR in the variety guide to that more dominant pathotype, there were a number of paddocks of Maximus and Spartacus that exhibited patches, highly infected patches of scald. And so both of these varieties last season in a range of regions from Esperance, Albany, Narrogin, Darkin through to Merredin exhibited disease. And so again, a disease to keep an eye on. Maybe the drier season will diminish the risk there. Not saying that Maximus and Spartacus growers should be panicking about this disease, but my suggestion would be that if you're growing any barley variety, but particularly Maximus or Spartacus in this case, and there are appreciable levels of scald in the paddock, then I would be treating that as a susceptible variety. Blackleg in canola, it's a disease we see every year, and as I said, a number of paddocks were affected last year. We know that it has a number of symptoms in crop. We would still suggest that this crown canker is the most damaging symptom of the disease, but you will see it in foliar lesions, and obviously we do see it more in the upper canopy, particularly in those crops that are planted earlier. And as we move earlier and earlier in our sowing opportunities, we do see more of that upper canopy infection. We know that there's a lot of canola stubble out there. Canola area has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. What that means that there is a lot of 1 and 2 year old stubble out in the wheat belt, which is a source of blackleg inoculum. DPIRD puts out a blackleg spore maturity map every week through the start of the growing season. What that indicates is the risk associated with your crop emerging, if you were to sow at that time, your crop emerging into a circumstance of stubble releasing, being at a point of releasing spores. And so on these maps, you can see the sort of the dark maroon coloured dots are areas in which at the date indicated at the top of the map that if you sow on that date, the likelihood is that the crop will be emerging at the sort of seedling stage will be at a risk of infection. So really what this is saying is maturation of spores is well advanced in those southern regions and into the Great Southern area. And if you're sowing now up into the Avon Valley and the top of the Great Southern, crops are emerging into that high risk environment. Certainly we're not saying that means that every crop is going to get huge amounts of blackleg, but it does mean that if your variety is not resistant or hasn't received the appropriate seed dressing or in-furrow fungicide, it may require some additional protection. I would suggest that going and looking at the Blackleg CM app and using that for your circumstance will provide you with good advice about the risk and the actions that should be taken in your crop. Some other diseases of note, sclerotinia, as I said, there's been plenty of sclerotinia over the last couple of years. Most paddocks that get sown into canola, lupins, this in the future will have had sclerotinia history recently. We certainly saw last year that the Kwinana port zone, lupins grown in the Kwinana port zone, the number of paddocks infected increased dramatically. So we're seeing that Geraldton, Kwinana, Western Kwinana zone, seeing increasing risk associated with sclerotinia and more sclerotinia occurring in crops like lupins. The other one I briefly wanted to touch on was wheat leaf rust in that Geraldton region. Last year, we saw crops that needed control. Those are susceptible or very susceptible crops actually needing control for wheat leaf rust. That's probably the first that we've had for a number of years. Whilst a lot of that region has probably been fairly dry over summer, there are a few places that have had that March and April rainfall. And so we would certainly suggest that we need to be monitoring crops, particularly those susceptible crops this year, not to allow this disease to get ahead of us. Finally, I've been concentrating above the ground. What we know is, of course, that if we've had years with big crops and plenty of above ground biomass, there has been also plenty of below ground biomass, and that is providing opportunity for root disease and pests to develop. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Daniel Huberley has provided this information for me. There's an increased risk of soil-borne disease inoculum. If we look at a disease like crown rot, for example, we know that in the last couple of years, in areas that have historically had crown rot, maybe we haven't seen much of the disease, but we do know that infection is actually favoured by wet conditions. And so in those 21 and 22 years, in those medium and lower rainfall zones where maybe crown rot is quite frequent, maybe we haven't seen the expression because of the lack of water stress. But if the Weather Bureau is correct, maybe this is the season in which we will see a bit more expression of a disease like crown rot. Not a lot we can do at the moment in terms of that. Maybe some issues, some options around nitrogen management, but generally speaking, this is just to let you know that these sort of diseases may be of greater impact this year. Running out of time, so basically we've already had crop disease reports this year. Downy mildew in canola, in early emerging canola, in areas where there has been plenty of rain, net blotch in regrowth barley. So certainly there are already diseases being reported, and we'll see how the season progresses as to how those diseases also progress. Thanks a lot. I'll pass on to Keith to provide a bit more detail on the barley net blotch scenario.
Now I'm supposed to talk on the risk for this net blotch risk for this season. I categorize 2023 as a medium to high risk. This is purely based on the rainfall, but the risk, what are the risk factors? We have seen that 2021-22 epidemics in the region, and this is a stubble-borne fungal disease. Pathogen can survive for more than 2 years. No-till farming system and close rotation, very often barley on barley sowing. Now, this picture shows what happened in 2022. Spring, lot of net blotch across South Coast as well as the central region. And after harvest, there were a lot of infected stubble left in the paddocks. So that leads into those infected stubbles will have beard-like looking fruiting bodies, which can survive for, if the stubbles are not decomposed, they can survive for 2 years, and they produce two kinds of spores. One is the ascospores, sexual stage, but they mature in 2 years and short distance spread. And the other one is sausage type spores like conidia spores. And this conidia, the primary source of infection, and that can spread for long distance. And 3 days after, wet stubbles can produce the conidia. And this is a shot what we saw in 2023 with a lot of stubbles around, and these plants, some of these plants are infected with net blotch. To initiate the disease, there are 3 factors has to be met. There should be susceptible host and favorable weather condition. Of course, there should be a pathogen to be there to infect the crop. A good example is going to this. This is a very simple observation. Try to correlate with the number of spores in the air and how the disease progress. And when the crop is seeded on the 2nd of May, and with the growth, it has progressed, the disease progress curve has been plotted on a control plots. And these brown lines indicates how the disease end up with. And this light bars indicates the rainfall, and the thick bars, green bars, indicates number of spores trapped. You can see there were little bit of spore activities in May, then gradually June, July, it's increased, September, October went high. That is the time they had the biggest spore numbers in there. And this arrow indicates the experiments we did with the fungicides at 31, standard spraying 39, and this is a threshold based. And these observations we have already discussed in the crop updates. So September to October time, we had 154 millimeters rain, and number of rainy days. Frequent means that frequent rain events happen 32 days, and the leaf wetness was there. And the temperature within that time was 12 to 14 degrees, highly favorable, and relative humidity is about 70 to 75% relative humidity. This indicates what happened when the fungicide treatments, the control foliar spraying to control net blotch. This open bars indicates the percent of disease, and this colored bars indicates the yield. The best results were achieved by early spraying, and at spraying at 31 had 13% yield increase. Now the interesting part is this work has done by the Sanjeev Gupta from Murdoch and the Deepert from 2 locations, Albany Port Zone and the Esperance Port Zone, and 2 locations, those net blotch infected leaf material collected and tested. And there you can see most of all these varieties are highly susceptible. And we found that the RTG planet pathotype is in the South Coast is highly virulent compared to the Oxford pathotype which was there before. This is an interesting one. Strategy for net blotch management. So select better varieties except for Oxford or Roslyn. If you are choosing, I know some farmers are still using the planet. So delay sowing will be helpful. If it's delay and less disease if the conditions are not favorable, delay application of foliar fungicides, and consider using Cistiva or uniform infaro. If you take about Cistiva seed dressing, except for where the resistant development has not detected, except Albany Port Zone, use uniform infaro. These are the locations which has been, samples has been tested. in the lower grade southern, a lot of paddocks reduced sensitivity for STHI, and one paddock had resistance. So that is the first occurrence, STHI resistance in Albany Port Zone. Now I will pass over to Janet.
Thanks, Keith and Jeff, for those presentations. We now have a bit of time for some questions, if anyone has some. I'm just looking to, we might wait a couple of minutes for some of them to come through. But in the meantime, Jeff, I have a quick question for you. Can you tell me what we know about the fungicide resistance status of wheat mildew in WA?
Thanks, Jeanette. Good question. Firstly, to point out that we don't, DPIRD aren't the people doing fungicide resistance work. That's being done through CCDM, but we certainly collaborate by providing samples to the CCDM. What we know about fungicide resistance in wheat mildew, we know that in the eastern states, group 3, so DMIs, and group 11, strobilurins, resistance does exist over there. So that's certainly an indication to us that that's a risk for us. To my understanding, that there's no presence of either resistance to either of those groups within Western Australia. Certainly last year, samples that DPIRD submitted to DDLS, CCDM, mostly from the Esperance region by Andrea Hills, had no evidence of resistance. In fact, had no evidence of the sort of precursor mutations that might indicate a progress towards resistance. So at the moment, my understanding is that we don't have resistance in WA, but the situation in the east certainly suggests to us that we need to be mindful of that risk in WA.
We've just had another question come through. Will growers be using the permitted MOA in 2023?
I'm unsure what the question is referring to. On mode of action, I'm uncertain if there are actives under permit, then I'm assuming they're available to be used. I don't know specifically the modes of action that are being referred to there. Martin's cleared up a little bit. So mildew actives, the answer, I don't know if there are permits for new actives to be used, and then the actives are available to be used. But as to their availability and their usage, I don't have any information.
Regarding net blotch for this season, except for lower grade southern around South Stirling, Amalap, Kendanup, Kojaneerup South area, avoid using SDH products because that is where they have been found the reduced sensitivity. If you want to keep these products going for a longer period till the new products coming in, new actives coming in, then use as a uniform in furrow, but it will be pretty safe for them to use in the other regions. But I know that there is a spot form net blotch resistant for SDHI in Albany Port Zone, lower grade southern one location and continent in that part of the world. So people should be mindful when they are using the products for disease control.
Keith, I've got another question here. It says, your technique of trapping spore of net blotch of barley sounds interesting. Can you please highlight on how you do this in the field?
We have passive spore traps. Most of the people would have seen those, and we take those slides and expose in the field for 1 week, bring back, and whatever it sees there, we inform the farmer groups in the region.
Thanks, Keith. Oh, we've had another question pop up. Oh, said, wow, thank you. Okay, I think that might be all of our questions for today. So the webinar recording will be put on DPERD's YouTube channel, and the PowerPoint slides will be published on this. You can see the address below there. We also want to hear about what you're finding. So we want to hear about what insects and plant diseases you find. In return, you can get a free diagnosis. So please use our free PestFacts WA reporter app, or at that email address, the PestFacts WA email address. And you can also follow us on Twitter at DPERD Broadacre for the hashtag PestFacts WA tweets. These are our presenter contact details. If you have any further questions for Jeff or Kith, you can either email them or phone them on these numbers here. And I would like to acknowledge the GRDC co-funded IPM for Grains project for hosting today's webinar, and the GRDC co-funded modelling and disease surveillance projects that are listed on the screen for the research data that was discussed. I'd like to thank you all very much for attending today's webinar, and thank you Jeff and Kith for presenting, and for Cindy for co-hosting in the background. And we'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye everyone. Thank you.